which also didn't help. I didn't realize any of these things.
Yeah. No, well, who would, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hello. You're gonna keep us in line. Now, what is your? Sorry, I'm covering this because it's on. What's your background?
I'm a psycho.
No crowd varies from kind of embarrassingly sparse to standing room onward.
So do you go back there like
Depending on
often?
various things.
I actually I have an apartment in Cambridge, so I go back and forth. So I'm not formally involved in the alumni.
That's quite a trek back and forth between New Haven. And so you live in...
I'm Ed Nersessian, the director of the center. Thank you for being here this afternoon. Before I present the participants in the roundtable, I'd like to say a couple of words about the upcoming programs. Our next program is going to be in April. I think it's April 27th. It's on the Anthropocene, about climate change. After that, we have a roundtable in May on shame. And then in June, early June, I think it's the 7th of June, we have a roundtable on status. And we are now working on the roundtables for the fall. We have narrowed down to about 5 or 6 subjects, and they'll be on our website shortly. I will present the participants alphabetically, and they can raise their hands so you know who they are. And I'm going to be very brief in their bios. You all have, I think, the printouts. Kenneth Dill is professor of physics and chemistry at Stony Brook University and director of the Laufer Center for Physical Biology. He helped solve the protein folding problem and is interested in the principles of proteins, cell evolution, and the early molecular origins of life. Priyamvada Natarayan, I should say, more formally. Is professor of astronomy and physics at Yale University. His research is focused on exotica in the universe, dark matter, dark energy, and black holes. She is noted for her key contributions to 2 of the most challenging problems in cosmology, mapping the distribution of dark matter and tracing the growth history of black holes. Some of you have maybe gotten hold of what we printed out about a prediction she made that has finally been proven correct. She made the prediction 20 years ago when she was a graduate student at Cambridge University. She predicted that cosmic winds driven by a black hole could potentially carry gas and other star-making materials thousands of years away from their host galaxy. And apparently now that has been proven correct. There was some controversy around it, but now it has been proven correct. Dennis Overby, sitting there. is the cosmic affairs correspondent for the New York Times. His reporting can range from the mating habits of black holes and zero-gravity fashion shows to science in the movies, the status of Pluto, and the fate of the universe. He's the author of 2 books, Lonely Hearts of the Cosmos, the story of the scientific quest for the secret of the universe, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Award for Nonfiction, and Einstein in Love, a scientific romance. Caleb Scharf, he is a director of astrobiology at Columbia University. His research career spans cosmology, exoplanetary science, and astrobiology. He currently leads efforts at Columbia University in New York to understand the nature of exoplanets and living environments in the universe. He is also Global Science Coordinator of the Earth Life Science Institute's Origins Network at the Tokyo Institute for Technology, and the co-founder of Y House Inc. That's it, Y House Inc. The roundtable today was initiated by a communication Ed Turner and I had together, and he has helped me in the planning of this roundtable. He's professor of astrophysical sciences at Princeton University and an affiliate scientist at the University of Tokyo, Tokyo's Kavli Institute for the Physics and Mathematics of the Universe. He has carried out extensive astronomical observations at numerous US and international observatories. Working in both theoretical and observational astrophysics, he has published more than 250 research papers with concentration on a broad range of topics. So with that, we can start.
So what are we talking about?
Life in roundtables.
Okay. So I thought I'd start by talking about, so the theme of this afternoon is life in the universe. And I want to mention 2 aspects that particularly fascinate me. First is a recent development, which is the expansion of the code of life, as it were, the sort of development of the synthesis of new 8 additional 4 letters in the genetic code, synthetically done, just reported very recently, just about a month ago, and I think Ken can probably elaborate a little bit more on what the implications are, but the implications are just astounding, because these additional 4 constituents, in our DNA we have G, C, A, and T, and these expansion of those 4 to 8 just combinatorially sort of increases the number of ways in which you could possibly create life and broaden the definition of what life really is. So I found that very, very new development, very exciting to read. And so I don't actually work on astrobiology myself, but I regard myself as someone who takes a lot of intellectual risks and is sort of bold. And so I wanted, I've thought a lot about the ways in which our conceptions of what life is and therefore its probability of occurring as we know it, similar to us. I think we've limited our possibilities. And I think we should open up our imaginations to really speculate about sort of wild other forms of life. And I think, in the past, historically, people have been bolder than we have been. And I sort of invite us to think more broadly about what could be life. And the second point I sort of wanted to make was about a new way to think about what really life is, and thinking about life and intelligent life. So these have been debates in the field across disciplines. Maybe think about life not just as the possibility for self-replication and so on, but also think about it more broadly so that we can bring in the concept of intelligent life as the ability to produce information and the period for which that information could last. So we could think about how advanced a civilization is, for example, because these are going to come up when we talk about how we assess whether we can have intelligent life elsewhere. And I think there's a way, if you look at the amount of information that's... Oops.
It's just you in the past.
That's me in the past, yes. So I think if we, I like to think about, so if you look at DNA and how much information there is, right? And we look at all the information in the books and the knowledge that we've created, we actually quantify that. I think this capacity to generate information that is multifold, so in our case it's about 500,000 to 1 million times more than the material, the information that constitutes us. That could be a new way of thinking about intelligence. I'll just stop there.
Subject of my new book. And I wrote an essay about it. I actually wanted to jump in. So you brought up, and I think it's really interesting, and I'm curious to get people's reactions. This new piece of work, I think it was Steve Benner and his group, who constructed essentially DNA with 8 letters, if you will, 8 base pairs rather than in the alphabet rather than 4. And and I think it's clearly a wonderful technical piece of work. But I have some questions about it. I'm wondering if anyone else has some thoughts on this. So, so it seems to me it's a proof of possibility, but it's not a proof of existence. And part of the reason I think it's not proof of existence by any stretch of the imagination is it's one thing to manufacture a set of molecules that do something seemingly more than the naturally evolved set of molecules, the DNA. But that doesn't tell you that an organism could have evolved somewhere that utilizes 8 base pairs because of the burden that comes with that. I assume, I'm looking at you because you may have a response to this, to make use of 8 letters in your code means you have to have a set of machinery, molecular machinery, that isn't overly burdened by the energetic demands of suddenly having to do more. How do you feel about that?
I agree. I think where these new bases are going to be of value is drug discovery, because they're going to give us better handles on being able to go after DNA and go after the proteins that they make. I don't think it's going to tell us very much about what life could have done for the following reason, that what living systems now uses 20 amino acids, and so there's this 64 option code at the moment, genetic code. And as you say, there's costs too. On the one hand, there's combinatorics, and that's an advantage because it gives you a new space of what options could I have. And yet biology settled on essentially 20, a few others, but essentially 20 amino acids. And as you say, there are costs, there are fitness costs to everything. And one of the things that you see, especially in bacteria, over time, is they really strip down their genomes and they strip down their machinery to be just as efficient as they possibly can. And so if 40 amino acids were a good idea, I think we would see it. And we don't. And I think the reason for that is because diversity, chemical diversity, is the thing that's so powerful in proteins that you don't have in nucleic acids. Chemical diversity right now, with the 20 amino acids, we have plus charge, minus charge, hydrophobic interactions, salt bridges, hydrogen bonding. We cover the whole spectrum of the kinds of things you want to do as a chemist. It covers all the kinds of little pieces of molecule that you want to
but isn't this contingent on the environment and what is available? So we're talking about Earth-like conditions, right? So I was just arguing for the possibility of imagination with these, right? No, not necessarily a realistic rubric for how you would make life. But isn't everything contingent? The ways in which things have evolved are contingent on the base conditions that were available on Earth. So you could imagine.
You can argue yes and no. I mean, there's a lot. There's this classic comment that nothing in biology can be understood except in the light of evolution. And that's sort of the point of view of, I need to know the history of something in order to know how it works. On the other hand, it's much more like a sort of thermodynamics problem. Once you know the environment, you can specify what the thing is, what the biological thing is. Think about an eyeball. I don't need to know where it came from, but it's really, really optimized to do the job that it does. It sees very well. It can see over 9 orders of magnitude of light intensity between night and day and so forth. Really, really optimized. And they don't have to know a lot about the history to know about this. One point, coming back to your point, though, also about polymers, is that not only the DNA, but also in proteins now, there's new diversity. And a colleague in California has developed these molecules called peptoids. It's a different kind of molecule than a peptide, different kind of molecule than a protein. And so it has different kinds of monomer units, but they're kind of similar in certain ways. And it turns out they do a lot of the same kinds of things that real proteins do. So in principle, life could have gone that way too. It could have gone a lot of ways. And why it ended up where it did, I don't know.
If I could say, I think that your first point about the new letters in the code sort of highlights one of the trade-offs or horns of a dilemma that our basic genetic code already presents us with. You know, one of the most amazing things about biology is the incredible diversity of life forms we have on Earth. You know, we always say from giant sequoias to, single-celled organisms of a huge variety of sorts to complicated organisms, mammals and things like us, you name it. It's hard to even think about the huge diversity of things, yet they all have the same genetic code in operation. Well, why is that possible? It's the same reason you can write a huge variety of books or novels using the letters of the alphabet. You've bought into this combinatoric world where a finite number of things let you do a huge variety of things. So you can write a novel that makes you a giant sequoia tree, or you can write a novel that, makes you a fungus. And you can do it all with the same alphabet. And you're adding a few letters to the alphabet, as it were. But the other side of that, and when we first discovered, when it was first discovered that, these monomers that make up the polymers, the letters of the alphabet, can be synthesized in natural environments fairly readily and probably occur, we know, in fact, occur in many places in nature, made everyone feel very optimistic about the topic today, life in the universe. There would be life everywhere. We could easily imagine they have the same alphabet in many places in the universe. But then the other horn of that dilemma is it becomes like monkeys typing Shakespearean sonnets. You have, there's so many ways of putting these letters together. The chance that blind processes, before you get evolution started, which selects for certain things, that blind processes will write you a Shakespearean sonnet or a novel or something, starts getting smaller and smaller. And personally, if it was somehow revealed to us that there was no non-terrestrial life anywhere in the observable universe, if it was just dead out there everywhere, and then I had to make a guess at why, my guess would be that this is the only place where the monkeys managed to put together a sonnet, and everywhere else they wrote nonsense, and life never got started. I'm not saying that's the case, I'm just saying that would be my best guess as a possibility. Adding some letters to the alphabet doesn't help that problem. In fact, it makes it worse. That's extra keys the monkeys could hit on the keyboard and, change a word into some... What
is nonsense and what is Shakespeare is defined by us and our culture. You could have a culture that defines what we call nonsense as valuable.
Well, it could be that there... Right. In fact, I think it's more likely, in fact, that if there's something else out there, it's quite different from us.
Exactly.
But it still has to be something that works, that reproduces itself, or that at least persists, even if it doesn't reproduce itself. So I think these new codes sort of add to that trade-off that we face.
I like the idea of nonsense being valued, or sort of, but then of course, how do you define nonsense? Is it just randomness? It's seen as, this is drifting into the question about intelligence and other things, but I really like
also
that.
Also value. How do we generate systems as a peoples of what is considered valuable? And so it goes into other, but I sort of close out with the eyeballs. Do you not reckon that our eyeballs, like a set of eyeballs, let's forget about ours, could have evolved very differently in a methane-rich atmosphere? And if our atmosphere did not have the diffractive properties that it did, that provided the basis for our eyeballs to have the range. They optimized for that, right? So couldn't you contemplate that you could have eyeballs that are optimized for methane-rich?
Absolutely. What I would say is, the argument I meant to make before is that I don't need to know the history, but I certainly need to know the environment, because that's really what Darwin's all about. It's about matching to an environment. And so if your environment was totally different, let's say it's black and dark like at the bottom of the ocean, then eyeballs wouldn't make any sense at all. I would spend a lot of energy on stuff that wouldn't be relevant. But the history, so this issue of eyeballs versus not eyeballs has also come up a lot in sort of evolution and intelligent design debates of, it's a complex system, and how could you get a complex system unless there were some hand in the making of it all, and so forth. But if you look at the history of the especially sort of early organisms like snails and mollusks and so on, what you see is a pretty nice story. Whether it's true or not, we never know, but it's a nice story, and that is that in the earliest mollusks, what you see is a flat row of cells where some of them are a little bit more light sensitive, and that gives you some value. Then, if you go further down the evolutionary tree, what you see is it's curved a little bit. That row of cells is now not flat anymore, it's curved, and that way, it turns out you can collect light. Then you get a pinhole. You keep going further down the tree, you get a pinhole. Then you get a lens. Then you get a complicated eye. So you can sort of see what's going on here. It's detecting light, and it's trying to get finer and finer resolution in that way. But I totally agree with you. I think biologists often speak of genotype to phenotype, which means our DNA tells everything, but it's missing one major thing, and that is what's the environment that we're optimized for.
Just because it's such a specific example, but I think this is true that the camera eye that we share with cephalopods and so on, it actually evolved in marine environments, right? So it's kind of like your methane environment. It already evolved in a different environment, and now actually we're the adaptation of that because we're walking around on the surface.
Right. And one point, coming back to your point, Ed, about the combinatorics, there's been a lot of interest in a number of these combinatorics arguments, some having to do with my direct area, which is protein folding. They also have many degrees of freedom, and how does a protein find the right structure in a reasonable time? It does so when proteins fold up in microseconds in your body, and so clearly the protein knows how to do all this stuff. But the question you raise of sequence space is a very interesting one, I think, because the arguments are, if I have 20 different amino acids that are making up each bead on the necklace of a protein molecule, what is the likelihood that I would be able to get exactly the right string of beads that would code for one of your favorite proteins, let's say lysozyme? Typical protein is 100 or 1,000 amino acids long. And if I have 20 possible options at each position, I have 20 to the 100th is the size of the space that I would have to explore in order to find that one protein. And so the issue is, gee, that's essentially impossible. Probability is 0. 1 over 20 to the 100th is 10 to the minus 130th. That would never happen. And over the years, what we've found, though, is that what matters is mechanism, and so it's very much in the monkey on the typewriter analogy. It's very much the monkey's hitting each key independently and randomly, but if the monkey was hitting keys in some correlated way, it turns out you could do very, very much better very quickly. And in the protein case, looking at protein sequences, how would I get lysozyme? The critical question between those who think the probability is 0 and people who say, no, it could happen. The critical issue is, how do you ask the probability question? What is the probability of getting the sequence of lysozyme? That's one question. Or, what is the probability of getting any sequence that folds to the structure of lysozyme? They seem very similar, but they're 100 orders of magnitude different in the answer that you get. And so mechanism-wise, what's been found is that, yes, we have a 20-letter code today. We have 20 amino acids that could go here or here or here. But what's relevant for figuring out how the protein folds and then how it functions is just a binary code. It's some amino acids, half the amino acids are oily and they don't like water, and so they glom together, and the other half are not so oily. So you have blue and red beads instead of 20 different types of beads. So if I have 2 to the 100 instead of 20 to the 100, already I've just disappeared 100 orders of magnitude of the problem right there. And there's now some experiments that indicate that something like that is roughly right.
I mean, it seems to me, again, on our question of life in the universe, that there's sort of 2 basic possibilities and places in between them. But at the extreme, it's that the monkeys it's completely random.
Right.
And at the other extreme, there's some deterministic sequence of chemical reactions, that puts together just the molecules that we need to get life started, which sort of sounds scary in a way, because it means life scary from a sort of scientist point of view, and that it somehow would imply that the existence of life was built into the basic laws of chemistry and physics. If that were the case, though, then we would very likely, I think, have tons of life out there in the universe. It would, because it looks like that we have tons of environments. I mean, 25 years ago, we couldn't have, when we didn't know anything much about exoplanets, it could have been there was no life because there was no suitable environment. But we're pretty sure there are plenty of suitable environments. So if it's a deterministic process, we're off to a Star Wars universe, so to speak, where every planet has something interesting going on from a biology point of view, mini planets. Of course, it could also be somewhere in between where there's many, it's just like the monkeys don't have to type exactly that sonnet. There are many sonnets that could have been written, and maybe there's enough of them that it's fairly common. But, between those 2 extremes, you get an empty universe or a full universe, and I think, based on what we know now, and I'm no biologist, I'm sure you know better, but it's at least conceivable that it's sort of anywhere in between. Life could be quite common, slightly common, quite rare, it's very important in science to keep track of what you don't know. And I think, despite the fact that I think popular belief is that there's probably quite a bit of life in the universe, and there's certainly a lot of popular interest in that. Dennis may be able to say more about that than the rest of us, but, we really don't know the answer, I would say, at this point.
Right. There's a lot of room between the impossible and the inevitable.
Right. Thank you for saying that so much better than
And I think in chemistry and biology, for example, a lot of the issue is how long does it take? So things that can be pretty close to the impossible and can still happen if you have enough little agents. And this is one of the great things about biology, is you have cells everywhere and bacteria everywhere and organisms everywhere. And so in Darwinian processes, it also matters just how many attempts you're making. And if you've just got a huge population and you've got a long enough time, you can sooner or later get there. And I mean, life, I don't think it was close to inevitable, because it certainly took a long time to develop it here on Earth, as far as anybody can tell. I guess you all may know better than I do, but it seems like it was about 4 billion years ago.
It depends on what your clock is, with what's short and what's long.
Yeah, okay. But I mean, if you start with sort of roughly Earth being about 4 billion years old, we had life by 3.5 billion single cells, and then another billion later we had multi-cells and so on. you take that, 500 million years is not quick, I think. So it's clearly not something that just happens like instantly, I think.
Especially since there's a selection effect. We had to be on one of the planets where it happened. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here.
Right.
I have to say that 500 million years doesn't sound like such a short length of time if you think about cosmology.
Exactly.
Right.
And so, well, one question I have is, what would it take anybody here to convince anybody here that they had found life someplace else? I mean, how hostage are we to our conceptions of it that we have? I mean, how would you know? What signal from another exoplanet would actually convince you there was life there?
So, I mean, this is something that a lot of discussion has taken place on in recent years. And it's interesting just, looking at how different scientific disciplines approach this. So, for example, astronomers who are looking at exoplanets and hoping in the near future to be able to get slightly more sophisticated data about planets that may or may not resemble the Earth tend to talk about biosignatures.
It's a spectra, right? Yeah.
Often so biosignatures covers a number of things. So one potential biosignature is what life might do to the chemistry of a planet, in particular the atmosphere. So the idea is with future telescopes, we may be able to probe using light filtered through the atmospheres of those planets. We may be able to see whether there are things like oxygen or water, CO2, conceivably even methane and so on, all of which we think may have an association with biospheres based largely on what's happening here on Earth. So that's a very simplistic approach, though. And already, even before we've done it, we're sort of running into problems with it. So, for example, in the last couple of years, planetary scientists and astronomers who are interested in this question have begun to recognize that you could actually have, in a number of circumstances, a rocky planet that has an oxygenated atmosphere, but no life. And the oxygen comes from a combination of chemistry that happens in the atmosphere itself, the breakdown of molecules like water or CO2 by ultraviolet photons, and depending on the kind of surface chemistry you have, that may or may not get mopped up by the surface of the planet. So you can actually produce a planet with an oxygen-rich atmosphere with no biosphere whatsoever. So then, of course, you say, well, you've got to look for the other signature molecules and build up a story. And so that's I think that's a very, I'm going to sound terrible because I'm an astronomer, it's a naive way of doing things. I think part of what you're asking is a much deeper question, which is perhaps more relevant to looking for life on Mars, for example. And that's been a topic of discussion. The ideal thing would be something to crawl past your microscope and sort of wave at you and look familiar.
Or quote Shakespeare.
That would be quite a thing if it
Just being cheeky.
or if it was dragging a typewriter and a monkey with it. And then, so then there's all this discussion. It comes back to actually something you raised at the beginning, which is, what is life? And maybe you disagree with this, but my impression after talking to lots of people over the last few years about this is within science, there's 100 different definitions that people point to as their sort of favorite way of encapsulating the idea of this thing we call a living system. Some people point to reproduction or imperfect reproduction, right, in order to have Darwinian selection, or metabolism or entropy as some gauge of what's going on. And actually, I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts on why it's difficult to come up with that answer, because it speaks directly to recognizing life.
Yeah. We think that we're alive. I mean, I think I know that, but I could be wrong.
Well, people sometimes say, the huge fundamental human question that astrobiology addresses is, are we alone? But I think the number 2 question, almost as important, is how different or alike, if we're not alone, how, are we unusual or not? And I think that question, the first question I would say is even easier because we can search. But until we find something, The second question is really impossible. It's as though you wanted to study, I don't know, dogs, and you'd only ever seen one dog. And so then you don't know what properties this dog has are specific to that individual dog, or to that breed of dogs, or to dogs in general. And, you know, you're just lost. And,
yeah, it's hard to extract dogness.
Yeah,
like
and especially without a fundamental first principles understanding, you know, like biology's like that's a dog, and modern biology's like that's a dog's genome, but we're not, you know, at the level of being able to answer questions like defining life at a fundamental level. It's a little like, as my colleagues Chris Chiba and Carol Cleland pointed out, before the atomic theory of matter, natural philosophers, as they were called in those days, or alchemists, argued about what water is, what makes something water. Is it that you can drink it? Is it that it can dissolve things? Is it can freeze and boil into steam? And there were, even Leonardo argued about what makes something water or not water. And there were arguments that they knew how to make sulfuric acid. Some thought that was a purer form of water than seawater, because it dissolves things much better than seawater. Seawater is almost saturated already with dissolved minerals, so it's hard to dissolve things in it. You know, when the atomic theory of matter came along, we have H2O, the discussion was over. And we knew what water was. So if we could ever have a discussion of, an understanding of life at that sort of first principles level, then we would be in a lot better position to talk about how to look for it and what would demonstrate it's there. But I very much agree with Caleb that discussions of detecting life on exoplanets these days are, well, whistling in the dark, hopeful, let's say. But, you know, it looks like it'll be really hard.
I think would be very difficult to do it with spectroscopy. I think chemical definitions and even basic biochemical definitions are very tricky. One of the classic sort of disproofs of simple arguments about what is life is metabolizes, uses oxygen, reproduces, and it turns out a candle flame does that. And then we're going to run into problems now with artificial intelligence too. What's real and what's alive and what's not alive. I think, you know, if you think about people, there's something, and cells for that matter, there's something about purposeful behaviors, but I don't know any spectroscopic way you're ever going to see something like that.
Well, people have talked about looking for pollution, industrial pollution, compounds, quite seriously, compounds that we cannot think of any non-biological way to produce them. However,
intelligence, it assumes a certain
unfortunately, even that, it turns out nature is really good at making things that are unexpected. So I recently heard a discussion, so chlorofluorocarbons have been held up as one example of a technologically produced compound that has a definite impact on a planetary environment by removing ozone in the atmosphere. But I've recently heard work done, people actually studying Earth's deep past. There's this giant volcanic lava system called the Deccan Traps, and realizing that there's a geochemical route by which Earth could have produced chlorofluorocarbons all by itself, 200 million years ago, without the intervention of intelligent life. So maybe pollutants aren't even a particularly good signature of any kind of life. Planets are quite good at polluting themselves.
So I feel that we're not ever going to converge on one. I think it's not going to be as simple as H2O. I think there'll probably be many different definitions of life, and maybe what we'll be looking for is some kind of Venn diagram to kind of make the decision of, okay, is this actually life? But Caleb, as I started out in the beginning, right, I liked your thread of trying to define intelligent life in terms of information production and the persistence of.
Yeah, and it also, it does relate to this question of looking for life in the universe. Rather ironically, right, if you found a planet that was beaming out structured radio signatures in a TV show, you definitely know there's life there, right? We wouldn't.
It would depend on the show.
It would depend on the show and the channel carrying it. So, then for that reason, just to mention, within my field, there has been a growing interest in, or resuscitation of this field of SETI, of search for extraterrestrial intelligence, although now we call it techno-signatures, because that's less of a trigger word for people's memories of what were thought to be failures in the past, but actually part of the issue with the search for extraterrestrial intelligence is we've looked so little. We really have looked so little. But that's the remarkable thing, is if you got that, you would definitely, unambiguously, I think, be able to say that there was recognizable life on a planet. Mm-hmm. And that feeds into this question of, yes, the nature of intelligent life and the information that we carry around externally to us. I mean, humans are pretty peculiar in that respect. We carry around and propagate into the future throughout human history, back to the first exchange of a story around a campfire.
Or cave art.
Or cave art. Dawkins would call it, memes, the generation of memes and their propagation. But I think it's even more diverse than that. That is an interesting quality that we have, and of course, it's conferred great evolutionary advantages to us. You can write a book about, don't eat this plant because it will kill you. And 100 years later, someone will read that book and it will save their life, right? So there's a certain advantage to being able to store this information, but it comes at a cost. There's an energetic burden to it.
So what is the current status of the SETI-like funding and programs? I mean, I know that in the 1980s, it was federally funded. It died in the 1990s. What is the status?
I don't know. Dennis, do you want to say something about that?
So I don't think there's, ever since, I think, 1992, when they pulled the plug on SETI, that there's been any federal funding for actual radio searches.
But there was private funding?
Yeah, I think
there's private funding. There's this SETI Institute, which was, all the SETI scientists said, well, okay, we're going to raise our own money, and they're quite successful, and they, Paul Allen built this big array of radio telescopes for them in Northern California, and now they have Yuri Milner, who's like spending jillions of dollars leasing telescopes, and wants to send an iPhone to Alpha Centauri, which is an amazing idea. But
Ed is involved in that.
Yeah, being on the advisory board of the Breakthrough Initiative, which is the iPhone to the Stars project, I should say. The Breakthrough Foundation, which is Yuri Milner's foundation, funding of SETI, is a separate initiative, although they're connected, some of the same people involved, and is spending $100 million over 10 years, which I think is so I think the current rate of spending on SETI, and it's basically a classical radio SETI looking for signals from, radio signals sent out by putative extraterrestrial civilizations, is probably the highest rate of spending on SETI that we have ever had in history. And the design of that experiment is to, Caleb mentioned that we hadn't looked very much. The goal of that, it's called Breakthrough Listen. Everything is called Breakthrough something in that world. So Breakthrough Listen's goal is to expand the volume of phase space frequencies and sensitivities and so on by about a factor of 1,000 over what's been done before. So however little we have looked so far, the goal is to have looked 1,000 times more by the time this is done. It started a few years ago, so I don't remember exactly when, but we probably have another 6 or 7 years before the project.
And a lot of the older...
But that's still a tiny fraction of the galaxy, even when they've
Well, you can look...
done that 1,000 amplification.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And it's very hard to prove something isn't there. Yeah. Almost no matter how much you looked, you could, always look much more, because you can look for arbitrarily small signals, you can look at different wavelengths. I don't think I'll be talking too much out of school to say that Yuri asked me for advice on what to spend money on in a SETI search, and I should have mentioned that he took none of my advice, which is probably why he has so much. But there's a lot of possible ways of looking that are not just searching for radio signals.
Right, it's still very very anthropocentric, right? I want to come back to that. So I remember mentioning to Caleb when we met last time that there's a book written in 1864 by Camille Flammarion. It's called Lumen, and it's imaginative. It's about a planet where you have sentient plants that digest and eat and breathe and speak to each other in a tongue that we wouldn't understand. So I mean, all these ideas of looking for it, looking for radio signals, it's very tied to a very anthropomorphic view of life. So how do we expand?
Well, I think, so you're absolutely right. And it's also extremely skewed in terms of, if you think about the history of life on Earth, for most of the history of life on Earth,
different
there would
stages,
be
right?
no techno-signatures whatsoever. It would all be chemistry or colors or other variations on the planet. So in that sense, it's already almost stacking the odds against it. If our planet is in some way representative of how evolution plays out, we obviously don't know that. Right? The fact that technological beings have only existed for maybe the last 100,000 years, we have really no idea whether that's the norm or whether that's some extreme. So I think you're absolutely right, and this is one of the, in that whole field, it's very, very challenging as well. People always, I think, fall into the trap of, well, a species would do this, wouldn't it? Right? Which is completely skewed towards our own, and it's usually skewed to Western European ways of thinking about the world anyway, and that is problematic. And I'm not sure we. Well,
it's limiting. It's severely limiting. Right?
Incredibly limiting. Yeah.
But the problem with not doing that, it's like the old thing is looking for your keys under the light post. If you don't look for something that's like us, you don't know, Yogi Berra said, if you don't know where you're going, you may not get there. If you don't know what you're looking for, you may not find it. And I think we've seen a recent example of that in discussions of the interstellar small body that passed through the solar system back in late 2017. Oumuamua is the name it was given. It has a number of puzzling properties, and the idea has been put forward that it was some piece of alien artifact, some sort of spacecraft or space debris of some interstellar traveling culture. And, I mean, it could be, but the problem with a hypothesis like that, the problem of just looking for a civilization that's not like us, is that it has too much explanatory and not excessive explanatory and insufficient predictive power. You can explain anything and predict nothing because we know nothing about their capabilities or motives, and no matter what happens, you could always say, well, that's because the aliens wanted to do this or wanted to fool us or do something, and could be, but it's very hard to engage that hypothesis in a scientific way. Doesn't mean it isn't true, but it's just hard to do anything with it. And
I mean, I think the one positive thing about, for example, the Oumuamua work, and particularly some of these interpretations or analyses that suggest, maybe it was a solar sail or light sail or something like that. The one positive element of all of that discussion, I think, is that, sort of in Bayesian terms, instead of setting the prior to zero possibility that something unusual might have a relationship to intelligence or others, to give it a little leeway. It's not zero. It's not one, it's some tiny, tiny number. And that to me is very interesting because we haven't really done that before, right? We've tended to say, well, that's we just don't think that's going to be a good possibility, which of course means, again, if you never look, if you never allow it to be one of the possibilities, you'll never see it if it actually shows up. So that's the one positive that I think came out of that.
I'm very sympathetic to that.
Yeah, me too. I'm all for speculation and playing with one's imagination and expanding the possibilities, right? So I was so one other thing that's always kind of puzzled me is Stephen Jay Gould has famously said that if we rewind the tape of evolution on Earth, you might not end up with us, right? So the role of randomness in evolution. Is there anything more we can milk out of just saying, well, this random set of circumstances? Are there people doing experiments like if something along the sequence that we now understand quite well was different, what could we end up with? Are there simulations? Curious of...
So I think one thing that is becoming clear now, especially in cell experiments, where you can replay the tape, you can keep running it, take the same set of cells, you can do all this in a laboratory. It's not like watching zebras over thousands of years and so on. And that's a very big focus these days of evolutionary studies as well, because you can work so quickly and see so much. And the answer there seems to be replaying the tape gives you whatever answer you should get based on the environment you end up in. So as opposed to saying, I can tell you exactly the route this took, usually you can't do that, but you can say, if you're ending up in an environment that has the following, then it's going to succeed in the same ways it does now, more or less, with some variation. And so largely it seems to be, if you replay the tape to the same endpoint, then you're going to get the same result. But it's like knowing...
So coming back to my methane atmosphere.
Yeah.
So if you run your simulation and say, well, you're stuck in a habitat that is going to be methane rich, then what happens? We can play that game now, right? With the cells.
Yeah. Here's what I want to do if I live in methane. But if you said, so here's the sort of root issue. Suppose I said, I'm going to live in methane for a little while, and then I'm going to live in an oxygen and nitrogen atmosphere like we do. And then you said, okay, I'm going to play the tape differently though. I'm going to swap it, and I'm going to do just the opposite. First, I'm going to live in this one, then this one, but then I'm going to come back to this one so that my end point is exactly the same, but now I went through a totally different route. Then the answer at the moment seems to be it only matters what the end point is, not how you got there. And often evolution does seem to take all the routes it can. One thing that the modelers, you mentioned modeling, one of the things that modelers have often found is if you work in very high-dimensional spaces, and these are all high-dimensional spaces, because they're spaces of, I could make this mutation at this time, then this mutation at that time. I have a lot of different mutations, a lot of different times. I could take all kinds of different routes. It's like traveling from San Francisco to New York. I got all kinds of ways. I go through Dallas, or I go through Chicago, I go this way, or I go whatever. I got all these different routes. And the thing is, I can't tell. I can't tell anything. When I see the car in New York City, I don't have any idea where it came from. So I think that the rule of thumb seems to be in these high-dimensional spaces, it turns out pretty much always easy to get from some point to some other point, but you can't tell what that route was.
And presumably, as well, so thinking in sort of practical, tangible terms, when we say, oh, the environment is, it's a methane environment or it's oxygen-rich, there are many other aspects to any given natural environment that may have a subtle or not subtle influence on what's been going on.
More important influence.
Right, and so in reality, so in a laboratory condition, maybe you do have that case of you will always end up kind of looking the same, but in a more realistic environment, there will be differences at some level because of the complexity of the environment itself, yes. I would imagine.
Absolutely, and this is really interesting because this has been a huge puzzle. One of the grand puzzles really of Darwinian evolution is the idea of in normal evolution is winner takes all. If I have an environment and this beast can take better advantage of living in that environment than this one can, this beast wins and that beast loses, and you never see this beast again, and you only see this beast. Winner take all. But if that's true, how do you explain all the diversity of life
that we see today?
And this is very difficult to explain. And so this comes down, I think, the answer sort of is shaping up to be something along the lines of exactly what you just said, and that is, sure, if I'm a cell, I care about sugar, I want my glucose or something, I need my food. But I also care about other stuff in the environment, and all of those things can be coming in at all kinds of different levels. And so ninjas are sort of everywhere. And you could think about this in a sort of a corporate world too. You know, it's amazing how many different kinds of Kleenexes there are, or toothpastes or something like that. You know, somehow there's a niche for everybody. They seem to be able to survive.
I mean, I've thought about that, and it always seemed to me that this idea of survival of the fittest isn't quite right. It's more like survival of the fit enough. You know, I mean, exactly. You know, it's I mean, in certain
which is
sense,
good for all of us.
Yeah, exactly.
In a certain sense, evolution is sort of a tautology. It says what persists, persists. So any species or creature, well, not a single creature, but any sequence of ancestry that does well enough not to be extinguished is still here. I mean, it's again sort of circular, tautological.
Yes.
And certainly niches help with that. But even in the absence of niches, even in exactly the same environment, you can have quite a bit of diversity of things flourishing. You know, you go to the rainforest and there's not one kind of tree or one kind of beetle. There's, you know, an insane number.
But let me object slightly to your point about survival of the survivors. This has certainly been an objection to evolution of, well, how would I define fitness in the first place if it's anything different than just surviving? You know, what is there anything there besides just being a tautology? You know, you survive if you survive. But the classic case that argues that there really is something more to it than that was in early 1800s England. This is was a moth called the peppered moth, and in the old days in England, the trees were fairly white with speckles, and the moths they were fairly white with speckles, and so the birds didn't see them. They'd land on the trees, and the birds didn't see them. But then, from the early 1800s to the middle 1800s, the Industrial Revolution happened in England, and there was soot everywhere, and the trees turned black from soot. And what happened was, the moths that evolved were black. So the peppered moths were still around, the black moths were there, but the peppered moths were the ones that all got picked off by the birds then. So the argument about survival of the fittest, what it comes down to in a case like this is survival. I think the wording is not great, because it really does sort of point you in that direction, point all of us in that direction. But survival is a property of the whole population. And I want my lineage to survive. But fitness is a property of the individual. And so here's a case where the population ultimately survives. You know, various moths are going to get picked off and not picked off, black ones and peppered ones and so on by the birds. But on average, the individuals that survive more are going to be the black ones. And so you can say, well, blackness is what fitness is all about in this case. I have a mechanism, that's the individual thing, and then the individual thing propagates to the population. So I think probably if Darwin recognized that this was going to be a problem, he could have, or somebody could have figured out a different way of saying it that doesn't make it sound too tautological.
Yeah, otherwise it's too convergent.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not contingent enough, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't give you a sense of sort of what models, you know, what's the mechanism underlying any of these things.
So that's, I mean, coming back to, I guess we're supposed to be talking about life in the universe, that suggests then, right, that one thing we could say about life elsewhere is there will not be a planet of where only life is a single type of organism with identical structure, because
Unlikely.
that is not how any of this works, and that's going to be a universal truth.
Yes.
That there should be diversity anywhere.
Yes.
We can't predict exactly what kind of diversity.
Yes. Right? And it makes us worry a lot as we lose diversity these days. Another related to that is the point about diversity in early origins. And there's a sense that in the old days there was sort of the sense that, well, somehow or another, some cells arose and they got competitive with some other cells, and the cell lineages were competing with each other, because that's sort of the fundamental feature of biology, is this Darwinian thing about competing and so forth. But there's this view now, this guy Nigel Goldenfeld at Illinois, and this view, very interesting, and I think it's very sensible, and that is that the way life emerged was not, you know, your family competing against my family and so on, among all the animals and species and so on. It was this big soup, of proteins and nucleic acids, and it was sort of like one organism, and the separation out into individual lineages didn't happen until much later. And it's interesting because you see this reflected in bacteria. There's this thing called horizontal gene transfer. And bacteria, so Darwin's tree of evolution says, you know, I came from my parents and my parents came from their parents and all this stuff, and so it's like a tree all the way down. But the thing that bacteria do is they violate this tree in a big time way, because they just cross over here. They just pass their genes over to anybody who wants them, and the genes get passed around. That's called horizontal gene transfer. That stuff happens all the time. It happens in us too. We got cells. Most of 10 times more cells or bacteria in us than are us cells. And they're in our gut.
Microbiome.
Yeah,
So
our microbiome. And those cells are doing this kind of swapping all the time.
Was modern technology pushing medicine towards that direction?
Very much, yeah. Yeah.
Direct transfer again, yeah.
It's hard. There's a lot of activity going on right now in kind of the microbiology world to try to figure out the microbiome and how much does your gut have to do with your health, and gee, could I reconfigure your gut if you're not healthy, and things of that type. The difficulty with it is it's harder, way harder than studying a single kind of cell, because you're studying an entire ecosystem, and everybody in there is sort of, they've got their neighborhoods and their communities, and it's like New York City, but it's in your gut. You know, it's complicated.
And I think there's also been a lot of debate about the microbiome in humans, or any organism that has a microbiome, and, you know, Darwinian selection in terms of this idea of the holobiont. So, you know, the microbes in you, what their interests are, what they want or need, may be different at some level than what you need.
Right.
And so when you look at a human being...
Oh, but this is a big philosophical question. I mean,
I think
so what, the
more than philosophy.
microbiome is not you? I mean, I would think it was you.
No, this is purely from a sort of Darwinian fitness point of view, right? When you look at a human, when I look at Dennis, do I evaluate your evolutionary fitness in terms of your cells and what you're doing,
Just don't publish that grade.
or your microbiome, or the combination of that?
Yeah.
And I know some people have been saying that the selectable quantity is actually the interaction of all these things in some sort of abstract sense, which is very, very fascinating to me, because that's sort of moving away to a different sort of definition of complex life that's not...
Selectability can be really complicated. And one of the things that's of great interest right now is that we make these things, they're mathematical things, and they're called fitness landscapes. And they look like hills, and what they're supposed to represent is that organisms that are more fit are higher up the hill, and organisms that are less fit are lower down the hill. And so these are just sort of simple mathematical, cartoony kind of representations of that idea. So the idea is, okay, let's see if we can figure out what kind of organism is more fit than what other organism. Here's the problem with that, and this is what's kind of new and really interesting. That's not the whole story. There's another thing that people are calling the Red Queen hypothesis. What that amounts to is you have predator-prey relations. It's not just about me fitting my environment, just an individual, and that individual's personal fitness or the lineage for that environment.
It's very dynamic.
It's the interacting with everybody. And so the predator-prey thing is, let's say I'm the prey and you're the predator, and we're both sitting at some level on this fitness landscape. You're equally fit and I'm equally fit, or whatever, and now you start chasing me, but you're chasing me around certain changes that can be made biochemically in me that have nothing to do with me changing my fitness, improving it or making it worse, or you either. It's just you're chasing me, and so you get better at capturing me, and then my genome evolves, and I get better at avoiding you, and then you get better at catching me again, and I get better at avoiding you. And it turns out we're running around this hillside, never making it any further up. But we have to do this because this is part of evolution too. And it makes everything even more complicated than it was.
We've talked a lot about evolution, and I want to suggest that Priya invited us to be imaginative. So Let's try to imagine a life form or a life on a planet where evolution isn't really a major factor, it doesn't work very well. And let me motivate this by saying, I think people are kind of a little hand-wavy and vague about what evolution requires, because they go, oh, well, we just have to have self-replication going, and then we'll get selection, and we'll have evolution. But really, there's a lot of factors. You have to have a flexible way of storing information. It has to that information has to be expressed some way, otherwise there's no selection on it. It has to make accurate copies, but not too accurate, otherwise there won't be any mutations or changes. But it has to be accurate enough that you're not forgetting information faster than you're generating it. And the errors that you make have to be non-deterministic, otherwise you'll always go in the same direction. So they have to, in some sense, be stochastic or random, so you can explore this whole landscape of different fitnesses. And there was one other. Oh yeah, and you have to have, since all this takes energy, you have to have a stable metabolism to drive it. So all of this fooling around with the information content has to go on without destroying your ability to make copies, either through metabolism or destroying the copying mechanism. So there's quite a set of fairly complicated requirements for evolution to occur the way it does on Earth. And obviously it does, we do have those mechanisms here, and it's played, as our discussion has illustrated, a dominant role in determining what life is like on the Earth. But there might be systems made even out of the same beads on the same basic biochemistry, which don't satisfy all of those things. And so you can have life and some of those factors, but it just doesn't evolve very well.
Well, I can think of
that might lead to just a contradiction.
Exactly, those kinds of simulations would be just fantastic.
So there you might find a planet which only has one type of life or something. Yeah.
Well, what it made me think of, and it's sort of jumping forward a bit, it's a very science fiction-y idea, it's an outrageous idea, so I'll say and it's not unreasonable. It's still, in principle, something that would happen sort of naturally. Imagine a species, a sophisticated species, sort of technological species, decides it does not want to evolve anymore. Right? Just says no, because this is always comes up when we talk about interstellar travel and moving around the galaxy. The truth is, by the time you end up on the other side of the galaxy, you're going to be a different biological entity because of evolution. But suppose some species decides it doesn't want to do that. So what it does, it says, okay, there's no more biological reproduction. We're going to build a machine, and it's just going to pop out clones on demand. Then you'll have a lifetime, and you'll die, and then you'll be, buried. But when you're not reproducing biologically, and now, so the question is, assuming the environment is stable, that could conceivably exist, right? And it's a sort of rational decision, right? I'd kind of like us to all stay the same way, right? I don't want to end up with tentacles or whatever in a billion years' time. So that could, I know that sounds like it's an artificial thing, but it's not, right? It's a evolution to the point where you make that decision.
Sounds kind of boring.
I'm sorry?
It sounds kind of boring.
Yeah, sure. Maybe
so
it's an unimaginative species.
You've eliminated sex from their lives.
Well, sex with reproduction. So you could still,
So there's
it would require an arrogant and narcissist species. I wonder where we could find one.
Yeah, how far we'd have to look to find one.
So there are examples of exactly what you're talking about. Andrew Murray at Harvard has done a really interesting experiment, and it turns out if his cells live in a very fixed environment and they never change, they start jettisoning all kinds of stuff that has to do with evolution. So there's this notion of the evolution of evolvability. And so the sense is that certain organisms, if you're in a very fluctuating environment, you have a lot of machinery to be able to sort of handle all of those fluctuations. But if you're in an environment that's very fixed, then you can throw a lot of that stuff away and you don't need to evolve. But then, of course, the problem is you're really brittle. If all of a sudden, someday, global warming or something comes along and just changes slightly what your environment looks like, bang, you're kind of your whole population is dead.
I also want us to think a little bit about it's quite possible that a species might actually not have the curiosity to go seek out other species, right? That's another part of the anthropomorphic sort of view that we carry around. I mean, there could be sort of a more content species that has somehow learned to live better with its environment than we have.
Well, there are humans now, humans, who say, don't go looking for aliens. They're going to come and eat us or something, slave us. That's a view that people now hold.
Or you know, that's one view, but there are also people who think we shouldn't be spending all this money on space travel or space rides or colonizing Mars or whatever else, and that maybe we should save our planet, we should eradicate diseases here, and learn to live better in better harmony.
We're hardly spending any money on those things.
That's right.
It doesn't make a mark in the federal budget, really.
We're not spending money on either of those things.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like it's people object to the attention being given to these things. I mean, as you say, the amount of
it's not so
actual
much
money.
the money; it's about the sentiment, right?
But it's interesting. So, just to be devil's advocate, because I mean, I basically agree with you. But in the big picture, the Earth will not stay in a condition that is good for us. And, you know, that could happen on a timescale of 100,000 years, it could happen on a timescale of a million years or whatever, irrespective of how green we become and careful we become and so on. So there is this bigger level question of, you know, and this is, you know, one of the excuses someone like Elon Musk uses for going to Mars. Well, you know, it's a backup plan, right? It's the really long-term picture. Earth, like any planet, it's good for us now. In fact, it's been in a period that has enabled humans to emerge, and it hasn't always been like that at all, and it won't be like that again in the future, no matter what we do. So I just wonder, I mean, the difficulty with that's really long-term planning, right? And we're not good at that as a species, which is interesting from an evolutionary
point of view, because there's a fundamental mismatch in the kinds of timescales on which we have evolved and the timescales. Perhaps it's the contrast between evolutionary timescales and our lifespan.
Yep.
Maybe that's what it is that is making us such short-termy folks.
Well, I mean, once you start thinking down those sorts of avenues, and maybe this is relevant to one of your future roundtables about the Anthropocene.
Right.
Because we've, you know, hate or dislike or try to avoid death, and, you know, at an individual lifetime level, we sort of conceive that wise behavior for our species, for public policy, would be to resist changes in the environment. You know, there's even this idea called, what's it called, Gaia, that the biosphere in general tries to stabilize the environment. I don't actually see any evidence at all for that, in my opinion, but would that even be a good thing? And, you know, there's this view that, you know, what do they call them when most of the species die out? I've lost the phrase.
Mass extinction.
Mass extinction.
Extinction.
Mass extinctions, right. There's the idea that mass extinctions are, you know, that there might be one coming from either human causes or other causes, and we'd better do something about it. But we wouldn't be here were there not mass extinctions in the past, and indeed, you know, the whole history of life, which we're so fond of, that not only because it led to us, but because it led to the
right, but the difference compared to previous mass extinctions and our being here is the accelerating lever arm that human activity has provided, right? And so this might be a mass extinction from which we may not recover at all.
Right, and we may not. Something probably will. Well, and it does seem to be going fast, but I'm not sure it's went faster than, you know, the asteroid that crashed down.
Well, who says that humans have to survive anyway?
Exactly.
Anyway,
we have our turn, and we're going to be gone. I mean,
right, a far more wonderful species could come along in the space left by us that has these traits of, deep thought and tranquility, and we have to get out of the way. I mean, we just don't know.
Or maybe not, or it's just our iPhones floating through the galaxy.
There's an experiment in cells that proves your point, and it has to do with time constants. What's my lifetime span versus when am I likely to see my next mass extinction or big devastating event or something. You can do this in cells, and it turns out what you do is you put drugs in, and cells don't like drugs. These are ones that knock the cells out. So you put drugs in, and you do it sort of periodically. And if you do it sort of on a time scale where the cell says, okay, now time is fine, okay, now I'm getting hit by drug, and back and forth and so forth, then the cell develops these resistance mechanisms. On the other hand, if the time constant is pretty slow over the population time, they just jettison that stuff. They don't need it anymore. And I suspect maybe we're a product of that too.
The difference, of course, it's argued, to answer my own question, is we have foresight about the future that presumably cells don't have.
Yeah, in principle.
So if we cause a mass extinction, it may be feeble compared to the one that was caused by when the great when photosynthesis changed the atmosphere to an oxygen one, but presumably the organisms that gave off all that oxygen didn't have any way of evaluating what its impact would be in the future. So maybe that offers us some greater, responsibility or something.
That raised a question for me. So where is this foresight? Because we're all made up of cells. No particular cell in my body knows the future. Right. And yet somehow, I think I know the future. Where is that?
This collective intelligence somehow, right?
And is it just me? Or do I need it? Or do I know it in relation to everybody around this table? Well, actually, I do know a lot of it in relation to the people around this table, because they're my sources, but is that me?
No. Maybe it was the aliens.
Eavesdropping conversations.
We asked a question earlier, or made a comment earlier about maybe these other life forms, nonsense to us is important to them, and so forth. So that would raise the challenge. How would we ever find such life forms if they were interested in what we would call nonsense? Would they be discoverable even to us?
Yeah, I mean, that relates to also, there's a thing in the discussion of SETI and the efficiency of transmitting information between stars, and also keeping it secure. And so I think actually this bizarrely enough came up in some conversation somebody had with Edward Snowden a couple of years ago. I was going to say, or Palantir, for example, I can imagine. So this idea that, perfectly encrypted high-efficiency data is indistinguishable from noise. So the aliens talking to each other across the cosmos, we might not
even pick it up.
See it as any sort of structured information. It's just more cosmic hiss. I know that's not quite what you were talking about, but it triggered that thought in my head.
Okay, I'll open it up for questions from the audience.
I don't think you were on.
Oh, okay.
Hello? And we're open for questions from the audience. Please ask questions and no long commentary. Can we?
Okay, this is not a question, but a few observations directed primarily to Dr. Natarajan and Dr. Dill, and then anyone else if you allow the time, which is unlikely. No, that I reject. 1 minute. All right. So, in terms the two factors that I've really noticed are, of course, that of anthropomorphism and that of imagination. So I'm going to give examples of why this is more important than it may not be apparent to some. A few years ago, a couple of scientists took a mathematical model of Darwinism in order to try to answer the question, what is the benefit that death gives? And long story short, it was discovered that for a particular group, not a whole species, but for a group, the food resources that are available on a generation by generation basis extends or diminishes life expectancy. So that is, the value is not for the current generation, but for the next. So that's one thing. In terms of SETI and radio communications, we're a very young species. Radio waves are the beginning. Again, relatively recently, counterfactual entanglement allows entanglement between particles that never have to interact, and it's also secure without using a non-quantum key, which means that if they're anything like us, except hopefully they've been around longer, a million years, 100,000 years, they may be using counterfactual communications, which in fact has been already demonstrated in the laboratory. And if they're a little bit like us and didn't destroy their own planet, and they're there, it may well be the case that they are making assumptions that we also are using quantum communications of that nature, which is why we're not hearing a damn thing. Because we're not there yet. It's still in the lab. So, and I'll just finish with why I'm motivated by it as Einstein. Imagination is more important than knowledge because knowledge is limited, but imagination encompasses the entire universe, and that also engages not just space, but time. In other words, the use of imagination to look at potential futures is not only wonderful, but necessary. That's it.
Maybe I would just say...
I said from the beginning that it was... Shut up. I already said it wasn't a question. So I just wanted a response from yourself.
Yeah.
Sure, I think Ed wanted to say something.
Yes.
Just very, very briefly, I would say that many of the more thoughtful people in the SETI community have long admitted that our best chance of hearing from classical radio SETI would be if our putative extraterrestrial civilization was sending signals intended to be easy for us to pick up and understand,
wanting to make contact. That's why I raised that point earlier.
Rather than us eavesdropping on something they intended for each other or whatever.
Right.
And I can comment on your first point, which has to do with longevity and energy investment. If you look across species, you see exactly that some species live quite a long time and others live a much shorter time, and a lot of this has to do with when do you have babies. And so if your physiology is such that you have babies early in your lifespan, you will die early. So you're just needed long enough to have babies, and then after that you're not anymore. And so, for example, we can compare us to species like one that's called the naked mole rat, which turns out to just live a very long time, for example. And what you discover is that evolution could have, if we look at them, these other species, evolution could have designed us differently. We could have lived a lot longer, but we didn't, because this is how long it takes for us to have kids.
Before I ask my question, I'll just comment on the SETI project. I have a background in electrical engineering. Electromagnetic waves are a very inefficient form of communication. They do not penetrate solid objects or electromagnetic objects like stars. So a more likely means of communication would be either what the gentleman mentioned, quantum communications, entanglement, or neutrino communications, which, you know, we have no technology that I'm aware of to use neutrino communications. But my point, you know, the entire supposition that there is extraterrestrial life of any form, let alone technological life like us, is based on probabilities. And the probability of our having evolved on this planet with perfect conditions for us to have evolved is still practically zero. And it took us 1/3 of the life of the universe for us to evolve, to be technological beings. If you change one single factor in our evolutionary course, if the asteroid had not hit the Yucatan 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs certainly mammals would not be ruling the planet. Reptiles probably would be. And I don't think they would be broadcasting sitcoms to the cosmic ether.
I mean, they could be broadcasting the equivalent of dinosaur sitcoms, dinosaur communication. I mean,
but again, another technological civilization, if it existed, probably wouldn't know where to look, which is what was discussed before. But let's see if I remember my question. My question is, since it took us 1/3 of the life of the known universe for us to evolve, an extremely unlikely evolution, does anybody believe that in the short 14 billion years that our universe, our visible universe, has existed, that there would be a replication of that evolution or anything comparable to it?
Well, there's an interesting story.
The probability is probably just too low.
That's what I believe. Can I just say you're making an awful lot of assumptions, including that we have any idea what the probability is that we're here. I mean, Ed might want to comment on that. Ed has written beautiful papers about this.
Right.
The level of ignorance is extreme.
But we know somewhat the probability of our own evolution because we know what the steps were.
I wouldn't.
And they were trillions and trillions of steps. Trillions and trillions of improbable steps.
But this is
change a single one, and you get a different outcome.
I see your point, but it's all about interpreting things after the fact, and that is.
Let's start with the probability of a replication of evolution to a technological civilization within the short 14 billion years.
I would disagree because I think given that unless you think we started on Mars, the probability that we evolved on Earth is 1. We're here.
Right, but
that's one data point.
We're here, but no, there's no evidence that anybody else is here.
So I can tell you an interesting story. This is back in 1972, 73. Francis Crick, the famous guy who discovered the double helix, worked with a guy named Leslie Orgel, and they put out this idea called directed panspermia. The idea of panspermia had existed a long time before. Panspermia means that life has existed in the universe before, and somehow it ended up here. But panspermia, the old idea itself, was just, hey, it's everywhere, and it landed here, and that's why we have only one genetic code, because there was this one bottleneck, and it sort of was the thing that landed on Earth, and so on. Anyway, what Crick and Orgel did was they gave these talks. I heard one as a graduate student, and then they wrote this as a paper called Directed Panspermia. And Directed Panspermia, the idea is, no, it's not that there's just life everywhere in the universe. It's that somebody out there is sending something straight to Earth for some purpose, and they're trying to get us going. And we could not, those of us who were in the audience couldn't tell if these guys were, I mean, they were super first-rate scientists, both of them. Whether this
pulling
was
your leg,
yeah, whether this was a legitimate scientific hypothesis or whether this was a British sense of humor. And at the end of the day, so it turns out this became quite a well-known idea, this directed panspermia thing. In the meantime, I think now the whole scientific community has kind of dismissed it, including Crick. Before Crick died, he then became sort of an RNA world guy. But
well, just a footnote to your comment, a footnote to history. It was not Crick who discovered DNA. In honor of International Women's Month, it was okay, Rosalind Franklin.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
So,
one of
Good afternoon. Extraordinary debate. My name's Anthony Finberg, by the way. I run a company called Eagle Genomics, and we're building technology to explore the microbiome, not just the human microbiome, but the microbiome of the Earth. And I've got so many ideas I want to try and string together in a very simplistic way. I'm not a scientist, I'm not an astrophysicist, I'm not a biologist, but I am a cyberneticist. And I just want to talk about the Gaia Thesis, first of all, in a quasi-scientific way, starting by just making a bit of a contrast. So we have most of the debate today focused on a happy accident, Francis Crick's happy accident, never to be repeated, versus some conversation about determinism. I don't know whether anyone is familiar with Eric Smith's work, the idea that the Earth is a giant battery, and that the citrus cycle as the basis for this chemical breakdown means that life is an inevitability on this planet. That was one idea. The second idea is we talk about holobiont. And that's really an anthropocentric view of the holobiont, because the soil is a microbiome fundamentally. Plants interact with the soil, we interact with the plants, etc., etc., etc. So, sorry. So I just wanted to try and expand on the ideas of determinism, Gaia, and on the idea of the holobiont, to ask the question about whether that might get us a bit closer to understanding what life actually is.
One-word answer, sure.
Well, I think it's a good question. I mean, so we have this tendency to think about things in isolation.
Yeah, or very linearly, right?
Right. So if we put it in a test tube and study it, we'll understand it. But of course, nothing actually lives in a test tube in the real world. And I think I see this coming up also, this is slightly different, but in the field of AI research, people talk about, how do we make a general AI that is like us? But you're doing it in a test tube, and I don't think that's ever going to work. It has to somehow be out in the complexity of the universe in order to develop more skills. So I think, I don't really have a good answer. I'm making a comment to your question. Absolutely. But I'm not sure how we're going to fully incorporate the enormous complexity of the entire biological system of the Earth.
Maybe one comment. There's a lot of complex systems that share a lot of features, and I think we could learn from looking at each complex system and the other. One example of this is that Sergei Maslov, some years ago, who was at Brookhaven, looked at software usage, how many software packages call other software packages, and what it was a story about is that some stuff is really useful, writing a little code that adds 2 and 2, and everybody uses that, and then there's other codes that are more complicated and so on. Looked at the complexity of software codes. And he also looked at the complexity of biochemistry, and he discovered the distribution functions of these things are identical. It's as if what we learned from the software, looking at the software, was that there's sort of swappability and there's usability, and stuff that's really good and useful, you just use it as much as you can. And there's a broader field, too, of what some people call explore and exploit, computational modeling, where the idea is you have complexity and you're trying to search a landscape, maybe some complicated mathematical function, and you're trying to look for say, the mountain peak or something. And how do you find it in the most efficient possible way? Well, what you do is you have sort of 2 modes. One is when you think you're headed up a mountain, you just go for it, and that's the exploit part. And when you don't quite know where you are, you're going up a little and you're going down a little, what you do is you just keep doing random things. It sort of splits into an entropy-like thing and an energy-like thing. But it's how Monte Carlo people and how people who do supercomputing protein folding in our kind of world, for example, all kinds of things that function in somewhat similar ways. They find answers in these sort of, with the swapping off randomness and optimization. And I think another example of this is industrial innovation. If you ask, so one of the examples that comes up often in Origins, questions that comes up in Origins is chicken and egg problem. What came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, that's a badly posed problem because chickens and eggs come up together, and so it's not, you don't get one or the other and then boom, the egg pops open and out comes a chicken for the first time. And and so this has to do with sort of the sequence of events that things can happen. If you look at industrial innovation, it's very similar to this, and also the evolution of the eye, for example. What's the evolution of the iPhone? Well, you can say, well, okay, let's see, is half an iPhone, this is the argument about an eye, half an eye would be useless, therefore there's no fitness value, therefore it couldn't have evolved, and it had to have come from some other thing. What about half an iPhone? Well, half an iPhone, there was half an iPhone, but it's not sawing it in half. That obviously would be a useless thing. Half an iPhone was, what happened if when we started back in the 1940s, we invented computers, we invented transistors, we invented GPS, we invented internet. Those were all the threads. So half an iPhone was sort of between 1947 and now. What would it have been? It was probably, half an iPhone was probably an Apple II, and it was large-scale integrated circuits, and it was some clumsy version of an internet, and it wasn't anything that looked like an iPhone, and it was not goal-directed in any way. And so I think that all of these complex systems, there are commonalities that we should be exploiting somehow or another. I don't know how to do it, and I think your point's very well taken, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only sort of brief comment I have is that you're absolutely right that probably what we need to consider are networks that facilitate life. So connections between conditions. So it's a much more complex problem than saying whether you need oxygen or water or, you know.
Yeah.
I sort of would go back and thinking about the issues you raised and the issues a previous question raised, is we're a little bit back to trying to study dogs with just one example of a dog to look at. I think Eric Smith's work on these cycles are a brilliant description of what happened on Earth. Are they relevant for what's happening on other planets? We just don't know, I would say. And again, we have to keep track of what we know and we don't know. And that question number 2 is how different or similar are we if there is other life out there, is I think something that we fundamentally don't know. What are the ways we might find out? One, which I think Ken has been talking about, is we may understand biology and what's happened on Earth at a deeper and deeper and more systems level, so we can see the patterns that might be the same. And of course the other is to search for life elsewhere, and if we find it, we'll learn something. My undergraduate mentor, Philip Morrison, who was one of the pioneers of SETI, actually once said, finding a single example of life anywhere, I think he said finding life on Mars would change life from a miracle to a statistic. So we have to probably try both of those. I mean, we are trying, and I think should continue to try to, advance in both of those ways towards answering those sort of questions. What's contingent, what's convergent, but we shouldn't pretend, and it's fun to talk about this, but we just don't know until one of those programs of research succeeds, or hopefully both of them.
Thank you all very much.
Hi. I don't know if you discussed this before I got here, but my question is about the extremophiles and the types of life you find in sulfuric lakes and in thermal vents and something like the tardigrade, where, what's going on with these creatures, and do they share DNA with us? And
yeah, good question. Yes, they do. They share DNA with us. It's interesting. There are studies now where you can take a given organism that's a mesophile that grows at our temperature, let's say, and the same organism that's the thermophile equivalent. So it does the same things, and it has DNA that's pretty similar, except it just happens to live at the higher temperatures. And you can ask what are the differences, and now there's something like 50 different thermophiles for which a lot of the proteins are known and understood clearly and so forth. It's an interesting process. You can rationalize to some extent how the proteins changed and how they became better at doing their folding up and doing their enzyme activities at the other temperatures. And so otherwise, they're organisms just like us. The DNA, across species, the DNA is very similar. The difference between everybody in this room is about 0.1% in your DNA. The difference between all of us and chimpanzees is about 1%, and between us and the great apes is something like 4%. And it's the same thing with thermophiles and mesophiles. The differences are really small and subtle.
So we can't really talk about the absolute requirement for life, though, in terms of...
No, exactly. It depends on the environment.
And also, just to add, I mean, those extremophiles, we call them extremophiles. Many of them do not do well in our environment, our preferred environmental conditions. So to them, we are the extremophiles.
Okay, thank you very much.
But the way in which phase pairs might not work, you can investigate that and learn something from it. You change those parameters and say, well, now what happens? Yeah. Yeah, the idea that it's going to just take off and become another life is not likely, right? Like, don't let it get out of the lab, right? That's not, yeah, that's not.